Okay, you're all set to start.
All right, if the prosecution's ready to proceed to opening statements, I am ready to hear them.
Yes, Your Honor. Motive and moment. Motive, incentive, a reason to commit a crime. Moment, a minute, any opportunity to commit that crime. These two things are like gunpowder and a spark. On its own, gunpowder is just a gray dust. On its own, a spark is just a flash of light. When you put them together, that's when bad things happen. In the same way, there may be many people who would have a reason to commit a certain crime. There may be many other people who would have had the opportunity to do it. When you get one person who has both the motive and the moment to do it, that's when bad things happen. Don Clark disappeared from his home at the Greater Tallahassee Elephant Park, which he shared with Miss Bassett, on August 18th of 2017. That will go undisputed today. As the prosecution, we must prove to you, beyond a reasonable doubt, that Kara Bassett killed her husband deliberately and with intent. Well, let's be clear, you may still have doubts at the end of today's trial, but you'll have to ask yourself, are these doubts reasonable? Are they grounded in supported facts or just empty speculation? Members of the jury, we will leave you today with a moral conviction that Kara Bassett killed her husband because she was the only person with the motive and the moment to make him disappear. So what was her motive? Well, we'll call Agent Seth Branham to the stand today. Agent Branham will show you a document called a power of attorney. This power of attorney document had a disappearance clause. If Don Clark disappears, Ms. Bassett gets control of the Elephant Park and his $8 million of property and investments. You'll hear she wanted control of this park. She'd been fighting with him for years. She wanted it to be a sanctuary, while he saw it as a business. You'll hear from Joe Young, who spent years filming at the park, that these fights got so violent. One time, Miss Bassett even threw a vase at Don Clark's head. They were so violent that Don Clark filed for a restraining order against Miss Bassett just weeks before he disappeared. So when was her moment? Well, you'll hear that on August 18th, 2017, Miss Bassett was alone at night with Don Clark. She was alone on the Elephant Park with a key to a shed full of syringes of elephant tranquilizer, which is lethal to humans. You'll hear that the logbook shows that there should have been 24 syringes left on August 18th. When the FBI searched the park, there were only 23. You'll see GPS data showing that Don Clark's Chevy was driven 139 miles to the Big Gum Swamp, a 13,000-acre black hole of boggy vegetation. That mud from that swamp during today's trial, pay attention to who had the motive, who had the moment to make Don Clark disappear. We will show you that the only person with both was Miss Bassett. It's why we'll ask you to find her guilty. Thank you.
Thank you. If the defense is ready, you can proceed.
May it please the court, opposing counsel, members of the jury. A murder trial, of all things, should be a case of evidence, not a game of fill in the blank. Now, you just heard this horrifying story about a murderous, profiteering wife who's the mastermind behind the perfect crime. One that left no dead body, no murder weapon, no DNA, no forensic evidence, and no eyewitnesses. The government wants you to believe that Kara Bassett, This 5'4" tall woman snuck up behind her husband with a syringe loaded with elephant tranquilizer, stabbed him in the back, lifted his 6'5" body into a wheelchair, lifted that wheelchair into a van, drove in the middle of the night to a remote swamp, dumped his body never to be found again, and then drove to an airport to make it seem like he just disappeared. And that's certainly an entertaining explanation for what happened to Don Clark. But members of the jury, if it sounds unbelievable, it's because it is. You'll learn today at trial that the government do not have any evidence to support that fantastical story. Instead, every step of the way, they simply filled in the blanks with whatever was necessary to support that conclusion. Well, so what blanks did the government fill in? Well, let's start with the biggest one. When no one could figure out why Don Clark had disappeared, well, the government filled in that blank with murder. But what Ms. Davis glossed over today is that there's no dead body in this alleged murder case. Instead, the government simply filled in that blank. Members of the jury, by the time the government had decided that Don Clark was murdered, well, they needed a murder weapon. So what did they do? They filled in that blank with the only thing they couldn't find: a missing elephant tranquilizer. But members of the jury, you're going to hear no evidence today that Don Clark ever came in contact with an elephant tranquilizer, let alone that it killed him. Even the swamp at the center of the government's case is just another conveniently filled in blank. It's their explanation for why they have no murder weapon and no dead body. But you're going to hear significant evidence today to refute any claim that Kara Bassett was ever even at that swamp. Just like everything else in this trial, the government needed an answer, so they filled in a blank without any regard for the evidence. Fortunately for Ms. Bassett, it's not enough for the government to simply fill in the blanks as they see fit. Instead, when they accused Ms. Bassett of first-degree murder, they assumed something called the burden of proof. They must prove to you today every element of first-degree murder beyond a reasonable doubt, which is the highest burden of proof in our criminal justice system. By the end of today's trial, I am confident that you won't just question one or two parts of the government's theory. You're going to question the whole thing, because it's not a theory built on fact or supported by evidence. It's just a game of filling in the blanks. At the end of today's trial, I will come back and ask that you find Ms. Bassett not guilty. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So one thing I forgot to mention, and this is relevant more to the jurors than to the competitors, is when the competitors are giving speeches, it's recommended that you turn your Zoom into speaker mode so that you're focused on the one person speaking. But now that we're moving into the witness examinations, it's best to move into gallery mode so that you can see the competitor and the witness speak at the same time. And to do that, there's a button in the top right corner of your screen where it can toggle from gallery to speaker view. So I personally am going to do that before we move to the examinations. Is the state ready to call its first witness?
Yes, Your Honor. The state calls Steph Branham to the stand. May I proceed?
Did we decide whether witnesses are sworn in or not ahead of time?
I believe they are stipulated to be sworn in.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you. Yes, you may proceed.
Good morning. Would you please introduce yourself to the jury?
Good morning. My name is Agent Steph Branham.
You said agent. Could you explain that title to us?
Sure. So I am an agent in the Criminal Investigations Division as Senior Special Agent.
Oh, are you familiar with Don Clark?
I am. I was the lead investigator in his disappearance.
What did you conclude from your investigation?
Well, after investigating this situation for a year, I concluded that Miss Bassett was the only person with the means and the motive and the opportunity to kill Mr. Clark.
Let's talk about how you reached that conclusion. Did Miss Bassett stand to gain anything from killing her husband?
Absolutely. So in my investigation, I found a power of attorney document that helped me determine this.
Is this that document?
It is.
What would happen if Don Clark just disappeared?
Yeah, so if Don Clark disappeared, Miss Bassett would not only gain his $8 million in assets, but would also gain control of his elephant park.
How much did he own in assets, cash, or property?
It was $8 million.
Thank you. And could we zoom in on that effective date paragraph? Was there anything strange in this paragraph?
Yes, actually, the defendant included a clause, a disappearance clause, that I had not seen before, and Mr. Clark's attorney, who I spoke to, also had not seen before. It meant that if Mr. Clark disappeared, Miss Bassett would gain control of the elephant park and the $8 million in assets.
Did Mr. Clark's attorney tell you why this clause was included?
Yes, Ms. Tuminelli sent me an email that stated that Miss Bassett included this document because she was concerned for some Costa Rican men.
So whose idea was it?
That was Miss Bassett's idea.
Thank you. Let's talk about how Kara could have committed the crime. Did you ever identify a suspected murder weapon?
I did. I found a missing syringe of carfentanil on the defendant's property.
Would it look like Exhibit 18?
Yes, this is one of the syringes that was in the container.
Could you tell us what Exhibit 17 is?
Yes, so this is a document that I reviewed that talks about the dangers of carfentanil. It's actually a very, very highly potent substance. It's 5,000 more toxic than heroin. It's actually fatal if it's inhaled or even if a few drops enter the body.
Did you ever figure out how many syringes there should have been?
Yes, I reviewed the records that the defendant kept of these syringes, the defendant and her park.
What did those records say?
The records said that there should have been 24 syringes in the container on August 18th.
Did you find all 24 syringes?
No, actually, when I searched the container that stored the syringes, I only found 23, which was concerning considering how dangerous and how meticulously reported these syringes were.
Thank you, Agent Branham. Let's talk about some other evidence you found. I'm showing you Exhibit 31. Do you recognize this?
I do.
What is it?
This is a copy of the GPS records that I reviewed in my investigation. The GPS records of Mr. Clark's van.
What night are these from? Or what day?
This is from August 18th, 2017, the day of Mr. Clark's disappearance.
And are they from middle of the day? What time of day?
The van left at 11:17 p.m., so the middle of the night.
All right, well, I'd like to look at that first image. Could you describe this to us?
Yes, so on August 18th, 2017, Mr. Clark's van drove from the Greater Tallahassee Elephant Park to the Big Gum Swamp, a distance of 139 miles across the state of Florida.
I'm showing you Exhibit 28. Could you tell us what this is?
That's a picture of the Big Gum Swamp.
Well, could you describe this swamp that Don Clark's van was driven to?
Yes, absolutely. So I've lived in Florida for 5 years, and so I've seen a lot of the swamps, and I've investigated this swamp. And this swamp is a 13,000-acre marsh filled with dense foliage and marshy areas. There are also forms of wildlife and alligators in this swamp. It's virtually untouched.
Thank you. I'd like to move on to that second GPS image. Could you explain this one?
Yes, so this is the second leg of the van's journey on the GPS records. It shows that after the van stayed there for 40 minutes, it drove from the Big Gum Swamp to the Cary Bell Lyon Airport, which is 5 miles from the Elephant Park.
Did you find the van at that airport?
I did.
All right, I'm showing you that third image. Did you notice anything strange or out of the ordinary with this data?
Yes, well, the first thing that stood out to me was that this van drove 139 miles in the middle of the night. I interviewed the park staffers and I was not able to find an explanation for why this van drove this distance. So it was very concerning that on the night Mr. Clark disappeared, a van drove to a 13,000 acre swamp.
Thank you. Finally, I'd like to talk about Exhibit 5. Could you tell us what this is?
Yes, this is the Laboratory Service Division investigative report they did. I sent some algae in to be tested with this report.
Let's look at the section titled algae. Could you explain these samples to us?
Yes, so when I investigated the defendant's property, I found some algae on some of the materials at the elephant park, looked similar to some of the algae at the swamp. And so I sent it in to be tested. So I took some samples from the Big Gum Swamp. I also took a sample from Miss Bassett's boots, a wheelchair found at the park, Mr. Clark's van, and a golf cart found at the park.
Oh, those ones at the park, you said that there were boots and a wheelchair. I'm showing you some images. Are these those boots and wheelchair?
Yes, that's the defendant's boots, and that is the wheelchair found at the park.
All right, well, I'd like to go over what you concluded from these tests. Did you find any matches or rule-outs?
Yes, I actually found that there is a very specific kind of algae at the Big Gum Swamp. It's called a Redfield ratio. There was a specific ratio of algae in that Big Gum Swamp. And I found that very rare kind of algae on the defendant's boots, the defendant's wheelchair, and the van the defendant had access to. On the other hand, I did not find any algae on the golf cart that was at the park.
So what did you conclude from all of this?
So because of this specific kind of algae, I concluded that the defendant's boots, the defendant's wheelchair, and the defendant's van all drove to the Big Gum Swamp. And I ruled out the algae at the park because the golf cart that was used at the park did not have that match.
Thank you, Agent Branham. Nothing further at this time.
Cross-examination.
Yes, you may proceed.
Now, Agent Branham, you believe that Don Clark's disappearance was a homicide, correct?
Yes, I believe that it was murder by Mrs. Bassett.
Well, you believe it was a homicide for two reasons in particular, isn't that true?
There are several reasons that I believe it, mostly because the physical evidence in this case matched the defendant, and because the defendant matched, there was motive for the defendant to kill Mr.
Well,
Clark.
Agent Branham, I'm asking you about your investigative report. Now, you mentioned two specific reasons that pointed to homicide, correct?
Yes, I did.
Mr. Klimico, could we get those blanks on the screen? Now, Agent Branham, I want you to help me fill in the blanks. Now, the first reason you believe Don Clark's disappearance was a homicide was the lack of a body, correct?
Yes, I was unable to find a body, and that was concerning, in addition to the missing syringe of tranquilizer and the things that the defendant could gain by killing Mr. Clark.
Well, Agent Branham, let's just focus on the lack of the body. That sounds backwards to me. It's your testimony that the lack of a body indicated that Don Clark was murdered?
Yes, counsel, I've investigated over 100 cases that all have to do with murder and kidnapping, and I found that if a van drives to the Big Gum Swamp, that the lack of a body does not rule out the fact that Mr. Clark could have been killed.
Well, Miss Young, because you didn't have a body, isn't it possible that Don Clark just disappeared?
I don't consider that to be a possibility.
Well, you never were able to recover a body, correct?
That's correct.
And the state medical examiner never determined a cause of death, right?
Well, we had no body to give to a medical examiner, but based on the other evidence I reviewed, it's the only possible solution.
Well, because you had no body and there was no state coroner that gave you a cause of death, there's no evidence that carfentanil ever even came in contact with Don Clark. Isn't that true?
Well, considering the fact that this was the first time that carfentanil had gone missing from the container, I consider it to be a very high possibility.
Well, Agent Branham, I'm asking if you had any direct evidence that Don Clark ever came in contact with carfentanil. That's false,
No
right?
direct evidence.
Now, the second reason that you believe Don Clark's disappearance was a homicide were the GPS records. Isn't that true?
And that's true. That was one part of my investigation.
And it's your understanding of these GPS records that Don Clark's van traveled from the Greater Tallahassee Elephant Park to the Big Gum Swamp, right?
Yes, and I linked the defendant to that van.
Yeah, you thought that those GPS records were suspicious, right?
Yes.
Well, if Don Clark's van had just, for instance, traveled from his home to the Carrie Bell Leon Airport, well, that wouldn't have been as suspicious, right?
Well, it still would have been pretty suspicious as it was done at 11 o'clock at night, but I can't say which one would have been more suspicious.
Now, when you investigated Don Clark's disappearance, the GPS records were very important to your investigation, right?
Yes, they were a central part.
And you believe that the Big Gum Swamp is the place where Don Clark's body was dumped. Isn't that true?
Yes, as the van stopped there for 40 minutes.
And it's the kind of place where it'd be hard to recover a body, right?
Yes, that's why it's the perfect place to hide one there.
Exactly. It's 13,000 acres filled with dense vegetation, correct?
That's correct.
So you believe that the lack of a body and the Big Gum Swamp, those two things go hand in hand, right?
Well, I do believe that the body was dumped at the Big Gum Swamp because of the evidence surrounding it.
Exactly right. And the GPS records were what led you to that conclusion. Isn't that true?
That's correct.
Well, let's talk about those GPS records. Mr. Clemenco, could we get Exhibit 31 on the screen? Now, these are those GPS records that you talked about, correct?
That's right. I just talked about them on direct.
And you believe that Don Clark's van was discovered at the Carrie Bell Leon Airport. Isn't that true?
Yes, I found it there and investigated it.
That's right. You personally saw and searched the van at the airport.
That's correct.
And the GPS coordinates for the airport are listed on this document, correct?
That's also correct.
And you don't have any reason to doubt these coordinates, do you?
And well, considering them from they come from a satellite, I don't.
Well, and you also believe that Don Clark's van started off the night at his home, the Greater Tallahassee Elephant Park, correct?
Yes, that's because, his van was stored there.
Well, and again, those coordinates are listed on this document, right?
That's also correct.
You don't have any reason to doubt these coordinates, do you?
I don't.
Now, Agent, this is important. So in between the Greater Tallahassee Elephant Park and the Carrie Bell Leon Airport, you think that the van visited a third location, right?
That's right, the Big Gum Swamp.
And again, the coordinates for the Big Gum Swamp are listed here. Isn't that true?
That's correct.
But Agent, I want you to look very closely. Isn't it true that the coordinates that are supposedly listed for the Big Gum Swamp are the exact same as those for the Carrie Bell Leon Airport?
I do see that on the document. I guess they must have made an error because the rest of the document points to the fact that this van did drive to the Big Gum Swamp. I'm sorry, I didn't fully understand that when I first looked at it.
Well, Agent Branham, just minutes ago, you said that you didn't doubt these coordinates because they were from a satellite, right?
Well, the images are also from a satellite, so there must be some sort of typo in this document.
Well, just minutes ago, you said that these were the coordinates that led you to the Big Gum Swamp, correct?
I did. I must have misspoke.
Well, Agent, you'd agree that it's not possible for two locations over 2 hours away from each other to have the exact same GPS coordinates, right?
I do believe that, but according to the rest of this GPS document, it's clear that the van traveled to the Big Gum Swamp. And based on the algae evidence, I also think that story is corroborated.
Well, Agent, you say that it's based on this document, but if this document is correct, the van never even went to the Big Gum Swamp, right?
I don't believe that's correct based on the rest of that GPS report.
Well, Agent, to be fair, this is what you based your analysis of the Big Gum Swamp on, correct?
I did, and the rest of this GPS report.
And Agent, you just mentioned algae, but isn't it true that the algae and mud on Miss Bassett's boots could have come from her own home?
I don't believe so, as the algae that we collected was a very rare, very specific ratio of algae that could not have been at the elephant park.
Agent Branham, you never collected algae from Miss Bassett's home, did you?
I didn't need to.
Thank you, Your Honor. No further questions at this time.
Redirect, Your Honor.
Sure, you may proceed.
Ms. Branham, Mr. Bellardo asked you on cross-examination about the GPS coordinates, and we saw that those were the same. But what other evidence did you find to say that the van was at the swamp?
Absolutely. So based on the map that I reviewed of these GPS records, it's clear that the van traveled from the elephant park to the Big Gum Swamp. And also based on this algae report, it's clear that the van was at the Big Gum Swamp. I believe that that mistake is just a typo.
He also called into question your analysis of mud from the Greater Tallahassee Elephant Park. Did you test any mud from the park that you don't believe came in contact with the Big Gum Swamp?
Yes, I tested a golf cart there at the Tallahassee Elephant Park, one that would have been driven often at the park, and I found no match to the Big Gum Swamp.
Even though, was there any mud in that golf cart?
Oh, well, sure, it was a golf cart that had been used at the park. I have a golf cart myself, and it's muddy, and I live in a suburban area. So, yes, and that did not match the algae that was at the swamp.
Thank you. Nothing further.
Recross, Your Honor.
Yes, go ahead.
Now, Agent Branham, you just mentioned your algae report, but again, you never tested algae or mud from Miss Bassett's own home. Isn't that correct?
Again, I didn't need to. I had found enough evidence on her boots and on her golf cart, on her van, and on her wheelchair.
So, Agent, you say you didn't need to, but you only tested one location. You were just filling in the blanks, right?
I don't believe that I was filling in the blanks.
Counselor, I'm sorry for interrupting you. I'm seeing from the government second chair that we're out of time for cross. If your second chair wants to verify that, you wanna haggle.
No further questions at this time.
Okay, apologies to interrupt. Does the government have any further witnesses?
No, Your Honor, the prosecution rests at this time.
Are there any, does either party have a mid-trial motion?
No, Your Honor.
All right, in that case, if the defense is ready, you may proceed to your case in chief.
Yes, Your Honor. Before we begin, can you see and hear me all right, Miss Young?
Yes, I can.
And would you please state your name for the court and the jury?
Hi, everyone. I'm Jo Young.
And what do you do for a living, Miss Young?
Well, I make movies. More simply, I tell people's truths. And right now, I'm working on a documentary about theater in the time of COVID.
And would you tell the jury members a little bit about yourself?
Well, I was born in Palo Alto, and I moved to Florida to make documentaries.
Now, are you familiar with the Greater Tallahassee Elephant Park?
Yes, I am. I worked there for about 3 years.
And who owned the Greater Tallahassee Elephant Park?
To my knowledge, Kara Bassett and Don Clark.
And when you were at the park, did you ever see Miss Bassett interact with Mr. Clark?
Yes, all the time. It was literally my job to document them.
And how would you describe their relationship?
From what I saw, their relationship was really good. They were very affectionate with each other.
Now, Miss Young, are you aware that the government has accused Kara Bassett of murdering her husband?
Yes, I'm aware of that.
And today, the jury has heard evidence that Don Clark disappeared on August 18th, 2017. Were you at the park on that day?
Yes, I was. It was my job to be there 5 days a week.
And did you interact with either Miss Bassett or Mr. Clark on that day?
Yes, I interacted with both of them separately that day.
Well, do you remember any argument or disagreement between the two of them that occurred on that day?
Not that I remember. Things were actually really good between them that day.
Well, to the best of your recollection, how would you describe Miss Bassett's behavior towards her husband?
She seemed really affectionate that day, really happy.
Did you tell this to the police when they interviewed you?
I tried, but they asked me only a couple questions.
Miss Young, I want the jury to hear everything you can remember from August 18th, 2017. Mr. Klimico, could we get a timeline started on the screen, please? Now, Miss Young, what time did you get to the park on the day in question?
Well, as someone that makes documentaries, I have to stick to a religious schedule, so I got there every day at 8 a.m.
And do you remember if there were any communications between Miss Bassett and her husband on the day in question?
Yes, I remember a couple phone calls and a couple text messages between the two of them.
Well, who were you with for those phone calls?
For the phone calls, I was with Kara.
Mr. Klimico, could we get a copy of Exhibit 22 on the screen? Now, Miss Young, these are Miss Bassett's phone records for the day in question. I'd like to direct your attention to a call that occurred at 12:34. Was that the call that you overheard?
Yes, it was.
And what did Miss Bassett say?
She said, "Sweetheart, I don't mind if you go without me."
Well, did you have any idea where Don Clark was going?
I mean, there's no way to tell, but he loved going to Costa Rica.
Now, Miss Young.
Objection, Your Honor, as to personal knowledge and hearsay.
Well, Your Honor, Miss Young here is not saying that.
Counselor, if you can hold on, I want Ms. Davis to have a moment to explain her objection because I noticed she unmuted when I thought I heard some hearsay, and I want to know what hearsay she's referring to and what lack of personal knowledge she's referring to.
Yes, Your Honor. Two parts. First of all, to the text message on screen, you would object to hearsay on that text message. Second of all, to the statement that Don Clark went to Costa Rica, that is both hearsay and lack of personal knowledge. Now, if this witness does have personal knowledge that Don Clark said that he went to Costa Rica, that knowledge is only through hearsay from Don Clark.
Just to clarify, was the statement that he went to Costa Rica or that he loves going to Costa Rica?
Yes.
I believe it was he loved going to Costa Rica.
Okay, so let's start with this hearsay. Let's start with this text message first. You're saying this is hearsay. Does the defense have a response to the hearsay objection on the text message?
Yes, Your Honor. At the beginning of this trial, we pointed your attention to Exhibits 4 through 33. Now, all of these exhibits have been pre-admitted and can be used at any time for any purpose. Now, the text message that you saw was just a part of one of those pre-admitted exhibits, and therefore is not hearsay.
Does the state have a response?
Yes, Your Honor. I believe that the state was testifying to a phone call between I believe that the witness was testifying to a phone call between Miss Bassett and Mr. Clark that this witness overheard, and that's what we have on our screen today. I don't believe that is a text message in evidence.
Excuse me, Your Honor. I meant to say phone call, but irregardless, the phone call is from Miss Bassett's phone records, and those phone records have already been pre-admitted by Judge Falkenstein.
May I be heard?
Hold on. The text that's on the screen right now, is that written somewhere, a transcript of that in a phone record, or is that this witness's recollection of what she heard someone say, for which we do not have a written record?
Your Honor.
And I'll let the prosecutor, it's her objection, so I'll let her explain this to me.
Your Honor, this what is up on screen is the witness's recollection of a phone call. We do have a record that phone call occurred, and we are not objecting to that evidence being brought in. It's already been admitted. What we're objecting to is the witness's recollection of what was said. That is not in evidence at this time.
Thank you. So just to make sure we're all on the same page, this is the witness's recollection of the contents of a phone call, while the record of the phone call being made itself is already admitted. What your objection to here is the content of the phone call as this witness remembered it.
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay, so defense counsel, does that fall within an exception to hearsay?
Yes, Your Honor. And my apologies. I was confused on what opposing counsel was objecting to. Now, this statement falls under hearsay exception 8033, a statement of the declarant's then existing state of mind. And in this case, Ms. Bassett's state of mind was that she didn't mind her husband going without her.
Counsel, do you agree that this falls within 8033?
Your Honor, as to Ms. Bassett's mindset, we agree that that would fall under Rule 8033. However, the statement also has a truth value to it. It implies that Don Clark did have a trip or some sort of event that he was going to. And we believe that admitting the statement would also admit it for that truth value, and it's not admissible for those purposes.
Counsel, doesn't an exception to the hearsay rule allow a statement to be used for its truth value?
Well, I believe that it's being used, I believe that it's being, the part of it that falls under the hearsay exception is the part that refers to her emotional condition. So if the statement was only referring to her emotional condition, then it would fall under that exception. However, because it has this other element to it, that part of it does not fall under that hearsay exception.
I see. So you're saying that her feelings about what the husband may or may not have been doing fall within 8033, but the fact that the husband was going somewhere does not fall within 8033.
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay, does defense counsel have a response to that?
Yes, Your Honor. The entire statement is offered for Miss Bassett, for the effect that it had on Miss Bassett. And here, the entire statement has to do with that. Now, whether there is some part of it that opposing counsel doesn't like is not admissible in this case because the entire statement can be offered. It doesn't matter if it is probative in some cases, it's allowed to be offered for those cases.
May I be heard?
No, let me address what he just said first. Counselor, I thought you said that this fell within 8033, but your response made it sound like you're not using it for the truth, rather it's being used for the effect that it had on someone or a relevancy response. So how do you respond directly to what counsel for the state said about this not falling within 8033 because of the implied truth that her husband was going somewhere? Could you explain that?
I would go back to what I said earlier, because this is a statement of the declarant's then existing state of mind. The hearsay exception allows it to be admissible under Rule 8033. And so while there may be another part of this statement that opposing counsel finds is truthful in a different respect, the statement is allowed to be offered for whatever purpose I or her offer it for. Rather, it may have attached other purposes, but those purposes are admissible.
Okay, I will give Ms. Davis the last word.
Yes, Your Honor. We believe that letting the jury hear this evidence will also go to show the truth value that we were previously concerned about, that it implies Don Clark was going somewhere. Now, opposing counsel does have other evidence already admitted that they can enter. They have text messages between the defendant and Mr. Clark. And we believe that excluding this statement from evidence today would best serve the purposes of the rules of justice, since it's the fact that it borders on the edge of this hearsay, the way it violates the hearsay rule is more important than any probative value can offer, because there is other just as probative evidence already admitted.
Okay, I think this was well argued on both sides. Thank you both for the back and forth. I'm going to overrule the objection. I think it falls within the exception 8033. So you may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. Now, Ms. Young, I'd like to turn your attention to those same phone records, specifically the text messages that Ms. Bassett sent and received on the day in question. Now, Mr. Klimico, could we highlight the first 4 of those text messages?
I'm so sorry. I believe there was another objection. Was there not another objection to the statement that the husband loved going to Costa Rica?
Yes, Your Honor, if I may have an opportunity to argue that this witness did not state that she traveled with Mr. Clark or would be able to provide any personal knowledge of Mr. Clark's travel plans. Any personal knowledge that she does have comes from Mr. Clark speaking to her, which would then make it knowledge gained through hearsay.
So defense counsel, why is this witness's testimony that someone else loved going somewhere admissible? How does she have personal knowledge to testify to that?
Well, Your Honor, this is admissible under Rule 701, opinion testimony by a lay witness. Now here, Ms. Bassett's not saying that Mr. Clark went to Costa Rica on that day. She's just saying that based on her rationally based perception, which is the test for Rule 701, she knew that Don Clark liked to go to Costa Rica. And if I recall correctly, I believe that the statement that my witness stated was just that Don Clark liked to go to Costa Rica, which is well within her right.
May I be heard?
No, that's okay. I'm going to sustain that objection and ask you to lay foundation for how the witness knows what someone else likes to do. Did she hear him talk about it? Did she see his previous trips before? Because without foundation to her knowledge of his likes and dislikes, I think that evidence is inadmissible. And I'm sorry to make you both backtrack. On Zoom, this is a little bit difficult. Like the objections can be untimely because of the delays and unmuting and everything. So I kind of want to give everyone a chance to argue these things out. So if you don't mind, I'm going to sustain the objection and ask you to lay that foundation for her knowledge.
Yes, Your Honor. Now, Miss Young, how long did you work with Miss Bassett?
I worked with Ms. Bassett for 3 years.
And do you feel like you got to know Miss Bassett and Mr. Clark very well during that time?
I'd like to think so.
Now, would you be able to testify to Miss Bassett and Mr. Clark's opinions on certain things?
Yes, I was with them every day for 2 or 3 years. I was with them all the time.
And did Mr. Clark often take trips to Costa Rica?
Yes, he did.
Objection, Your Honor, as to the witness's knowledge.
I'm going to overrule the objection. I think the foundation has been laid for her knowledge. You may proceed.
And now, when you would see Mr. Clark go on these trips, did he seem happy?
Yeah, he seemed really happy. He had a pilot's license and a plane, so he used that to go.
Now, Miss Young, I'd like to go back to those same phone records and talk about the text messages. Now, I think on your screen you have the first 4 of those text messages highlighted. Who does it appear that Miss Bassett is texting at 2:30 in the afternoon?
It looks like she's texting Dawn.
And were you with Miss Bassett when she sent these texts?
Yes, I was.
Well, do you remember her seeming angry or distressed during that time?
No, I remember Kara being really happy, actually.
And could you please read these text messages for the court and the jury?
Yes. Where are you? With guests. What's up? Want to talk to you about trip to CR. Okay, but I'm fine with whatever. Just want you to be happy. Love you. And then a heart emoji.
Now, how would you characterize Miss Bassett's final text message to her husband?
It seems really affectionate.
Now, can we add those text messages to our timeline, Mr. Clemico? I'd like to talk about whether you found anything strange on the night in question. Were you aware of anything suspicious that occurred on August 18th, 2017?
Well, later that day, I was hanging out with Don, and he received a phone call.
Could you be a little bit more specific?
Yes, I was telling him about my upcoming trip to Mexico when he got a phone call, a text message, and his face turned sheet white, and he looked really scared.
Mr. Clemico, or excuse me, Miss Young, could you tell us when that text message was received by Mr. Clark?
It was about 6 o'clock, the night he disappeared.
Could we highlight any text messages that occurred around 6 o'clock, please? Now, when was the text message on your screen received by Mr. Clark?
6 p.m.
And you mentioned that his reaction to receiving it was memorable. Could you describe what you mean?
Like I said, he looked really scared. His face turned white, like he'd seen a ghost or something. I'd never seen Dawn like that.
Could you please read that text message for the court and the jury?
Yes. Okay. I don't speak Spanish, but I put it into a translator earlier, and it says, "Call me immediately."
And who does that text message say it is from?
It says it's from someone in San Jose, Costa Rica, but it's an unlisted number.
Based on Mr. Clark's emotions and physical expressions, what, if anything, did you perceive?
I perceived that it wasn't a good text.
Now, Miss Young, after Mr. Clark received these messages, what happened?
He walked away, and that was the last time that I saw him.
Mr. Clemico, could we highlight any calls that were made around 6 o'clock? Miss Young, when does the highlighted call say it was made?
It happened at 6. So after Dawn got the calls, he called the number, and then he walked away.
And how long does it say that call to that unlisted Costa Rican phone number lasted?
52 minutes.
Thank you, Miss Young. No further questions at this time.
Cross-examination?
Yes, you may proceed.
Good morning, Ms. Young.
Good morning.
You talked a lot on direct examination about Kara Bassett and Don Clark's relationship on August 18th, but I'd like to talk about what it was like on the days and weeks leading up to that. Now, Kara and Don, they fought a lot, didn't they?
I'm sorry, could you repeat your question? You cut out.
Yep, sorry. Can you see and hear me okay now?
Yes, thank you.
Perfect. Now, Kara and Don, they fought a lot, didn't they?
They fought about the elephants, not about their relationship.
Do you have Exhibit 36 in front of you?
Yes, 1 second, please. Okay.
And this is a recording you took of Kara Bassett in August of 2017?
Yes, it is. Actually, I believe it was, I'm sorry, it was June of 2017.
So summer of 2017?
Yes.
And it's a fair and accurate recording?
Yes, from the last time that I saw it, it's fair and accurate.
Your Honor, the state offers Exhibit 36 into evidence.
No objections, Your Honor.
Okay, it's received.
Mr. Anderson, would you play Exhibit 36 for us?
Oh, I'm steaming. This is a business, not a charity. As long as it's my money, we'll run it that way. That's what Don said to me. Can you believe that? We'll see how this ends.
These fights she's talking about, you said that these were about the elephant park, correct?
Yes, when
They
she
got
was
violent. Sorry.
when she was talking about this is a business, not a charity, he was talking about the elephant park.
These fights got violent, didn't they?
I'm sorry, I don't know what you mean.
Well, during one of them, Miss Bassett threw a vase at Mr. Clark's head.
Objection, Your Honor. Rule 404, may I be heard?
Yes, you may.
Your Honor, opposing counsel is trying to offer this evidence and testimony to show that because Miss Bassett threw a vase at her husband on one occasion, she was more likely to assault him and potentially kill him on another. And that's offered for propensity purposes, and it is inadmissible under Rule 404.
May I be heard, Your Honor?
Yes, go ahead.
On direct examination, opposing counsel offered evidence that Kara and Don Clark had a loving and affectionate relationship, and that they had that they were in a good spot on the day that he disappeared. Now, we are offering this evidence to rebut that.
Yes, did you not bring in evidence to show the defendant's good character? How can you do that and then not allow the prosecution to bring in evidence of his of her bad character?
Well, Your Honor, our evidence was offered simply to show that the defendant and her husband liked each other on the day in question. But this evidence is offered for propensity purposes, and they're trying to show that because Miss Bassett assaulted her husband and ultimately led to him seeking a restraining order, that she was more likely to do it in the future. And again, that is simply inadmissible.
Your Honor, we are offering this to show that Mr. Clark was in a scary situation, and we are offering this to rebut the character evidence that counsel offered during their direct.
I'm going to overrule the objection. I think that the defense opened the door to this line of questioning when they talked about the good relationship between the couple. So the objection's overruled.
Yes, Your Honor. Now, Ms. Young, these fights got violent, didn't they?
I was there for 2.5 years, and I only saw them physically fight one time.
When Miss Bassett threw the vase at Don Clark's head.
She threw it, it missed his head, and they were fine after that.
It hit the wall and shattered, didn't it?
Yeah, it did.
Well, you're familiar with Exhibit 34, aren't you?
Yes.
This is a restraining order that Don Clark filed.
I think so.
Mr. And you recognize the handwriting to be his own?
I'm pretty sure that's his.
Your Honor, prosecution offers Exhibit 34 into evidence.
Are there any objections?
No objections at this time, Your Honor.
It's received.
Ms. Young, I'd like to focus on the paragraph that Don Clark wrote. Could you read one more slide, Mr. Anderson? He says that Kara Bassett told him, "Let me run the park my way or I'm gonna kill you." Is that correct?
That's what he said, but I don't think Kara would ever say something like that.
Well, Mr. Clark wrote, "I'm afraid she's gonna kill me in my sleep." Did I read that right?
That's his belief, but again, this restraining order was denied.
Well, let's move on to the phone records that you were talking about on direct examination. You were talking about how Miss Bassett sent her husband lots of nice texts that day, correct?
I believe I only said 4, but yes, they were very affectionate that day.
Mr. Anderson, could we have Exhibit 21 up on the screen? Or sorry, Exhibit 22. I'd like to talk about what Ms. Bassett did after the day in question.
I'm sorry, counsel, I don't see any exhibit on the screen.
Oh, sorry.
That's all right.
Could you pull it up in front of you?
Yes, that's fine.
On this exhibit, it shows that after Mr. Clark disappeared, Ms. Bassett didn't call him once, did she?
That's true.
She didn't check to send him a text asking where he was?
Counsel, the week after Mr. Clark disappeared, Kara was the most depressed and sad I had ever seen her.
Well, you actually don't know about the week after he disappeared because you were out of town, weren't you?
Once I got back, and
But you were gone for the entire week after Mr. Clark disappeared, isn't that right?
I got back on the 26th, and that's when I started noting Miss Bassett's intense sadness. She missed her husband.
You left town on the 18th, isn't that right?
Yeah, I was going to film the next season of Bachelor in Paradise.
Well, let's talk about what happened when you got back. Miss Bassett let all the park employees go, didn't she?
Yes, that's when she changed the park into a sanctuary.
That's right. The park was a sanctuary just 2 months after Don Clark disappeared. Isn't that right?
Yes, that's true.
You felt like that was a pretty quick turnaround, didn't you?
I'm sorry, I don't know what you mean.
Well, it was only 2 months. Isn't that right?
Yes, it was 2 months between when Mr. Clark disappeared and when she changed it into a sanctuary.
Well, let's talk about those calls to Costa Rica. You don't know who was on the other end of those calls, do you?
No, I don't. It was an unlisted number.
And Don Clark had said to you earlier that day on August 18th that he was going to see you when you got back from your trip. Isn't that right?
I believe that's what he said.
Thank you. Nothing further.
Is there a redirect?
No redirect, Your Honor.
All right, the witness may be excused. Okay, I have some instructions for the members of the jury before we head into closing arguments, but just to be sure, defense, do you have any further witnesses?
No, Your Honor. The defense rests at this time.
All right. So members of the jury, we're now about to hear closing arguments from each party. Everyone should switch back to speaker view so that you can only see the person speaking as opposed to me and all of the other mess of Zoom. And because the witnesses have completed their testimony, you are now encouraged to complete the witness portion of your ballot. And I will give everyone a minute or two to do that before we proceed. Okay, there's also going to be time, of course, at the end to finish the ballot. And so I'm going to allow the state to begin with their closing arguments.
Yes, Your Honor. Motive and moment. Those are the two things that we told you to look for at the beginning of today's trial. They're like gunpowder and a spark. Harmless when they're apart, lethal when they're together. In the same way, we have shown you that Kara Bassett had the motive and she had the moment to make Don Clark disappear. Let's jump straight into it. Kara Bassett's motive. We showed you the power of attorney document today. We established that Miss Bassett wanted control of Don Clark's elephant park. We've established that these fights got violent, that she threw a vase at Don Clark's head, that Don Clark filed a restraining order against her. Don Clark was scared. He wrote, "I'm afraid she's gonna kill me in my sleep." And he had good reason to, because if he disappeared, Miss Bassett became his attorney. In fact, she would have power over his $8 million. She'd have power over the elephant park. That disappearance clause, that was her idea. That wasn't standard. That wasn't something that comes in every power of attorney document. No, Ms. Branham testified today that Mandy Tuminelli, Don Clark's lawyer, told her that Miss Bassett insisted on adding that clause. It makes sense. And you realize that if Don Clark disappeared, she now stood to gain $8 million from his disappearance. So let's move on to Kara Bassett's moment. You heard that she was alone with Don Clark on the night he disappeared. Joe Young, who said that she had been filming as a full-time job at the Greater Tallahassee Elephant Park, she was out of town. She had left on a plane to Mexico. She wouldn't be back for an entire week. There'd be no cameras, no one watching. Miss Bassett was alone with Don Clark. And with the key to a shed full of elephant tranquilizers. We've established today that carfentanil is a dangerous substance. Just 1 milligram is enough to kill a man. You saw the logbook. On August 18th of 2017, there should have been 24 syringes left. When the FBI searched the property, there were only 23. You heard Miss Branham. This is the first time they have any record of any carfentanil going missing at the Greater Tallahassee Elephant Park. And it went missing the same night as Don Clark. Finally, the GPS records. They show that Don Clark's van was driven to the Big Gum Swamp. Now you heard about the GPS coordinate mix-up, but you also saw the maps that identified the Big Gum Swamp, and you heard about the forensic tests that found mud from the Big Gum Swamp inside of that van. Where else did they find it? They found it at the Greater Tallahassee Elephant Park. They didn't find it on the golf cart or anything that had only been at the Greater Tallahassee Elephant Park. No, they found it on a wheelchair that was big enough to move a full-grown man. They found it on Miss Bassett's boots. Now, the defense will get up and address you in just a minute. They might throw out the idea that Don Clark left to go to Costa Rica of his own free will, or maybe someone from Costa Rica had something to do with it. But ask yourself, who stood to gain $8 million from Don Clark's disappearance? Who had access to a shed full of tranquilizers? Who had the motive, who had the moment, who had the mud from the Big Gum Swamp on her boot? The answer isn't an unknown from Costa Rica. The answer is Kara Bassett. That's why we'll ask you to find her guilty, because she had the motive, the moment. Thank you.
May it please the court, Ms. Davis, members of the jury, Don Clark had the moment and the motive to disappear. On August 18th, 2017, Don Clark sent a text to his wife. He wanted to discuss potential real estate holdings in Costa Rica. But a few hours later, he received multiple threatening text messages from an unlisted Costa Rican phone number. An eyewitness sees him receive these text messages, sees the color drain from his face, sees the fear in his eyes. Don Clark rushes off and he calls back that unlisted Costa Rican number. And for 52 minutes, he pleads with the person who would become his killer. Later that same night, Don Clark walks out the front door of his home, gets in his white Chevrolet Express, and drives to the local airport where his plane was kept to protect his loving wife. Members of the jury, Don Clark never made it to that airport, and Miss Bassett never saw her husband again. Now, that's not the story the government told you, but it could have been, and maybe it should have been. We don't know. We don't know because from the moment Mr. Clark disappeared, the government assumed that Kara Bassett was the culprit. So every step of the way, they simply filled in the blanks with whatever was necessary to support that conclusion. Why? Why were they so certain that Miss Bassett was guilty? Well, it all started with bad information, because when Don Clark's van was discovered stationary at the Carrie Bell Leon Airport, well, Agent Branham and the FBI did exactly what they should have done. They requested the GPS records for Don Clark's van to find out where it had been. And those GPS records were supplied by a company called Navistar GPS Records. And those GPS records showed that on the night in question, Don Clark's van only went to 2 locations: his home and the Greater Tallahassee Elephant Park. But here's the problem. On that report where those GPS records were listed, the coordinates for the Carrie Bell Leon Airport were mislabeled. They were listed twice, but now they were listed as Big Gum Swamp. Members of the jury, it's impossible for 2 locations over 2 hours away from each other have the same coordinates. Agent Branham even admitted under cross-examination that she didn't even realize this discrepancy until today in court. But from the moment Agent Branham read that investigative report, she knew that the Big Gum Swamp, it mattered. So what did she do? She filled in the blanks to explain the swamp. When the government failed to recover a body, they filled in that blank with the swamp. They filled in that blank with bad information, because when they searched the swamp, they found nothing of significance. So what did they do? Instead of admitting that they might be wrong and they might be headed down the wrong path, they filled in that blank with gators. Alligators must have eaten that body. Members of the jury, then they found evidence from the swamp that was mud and algae, and they traced it back to the defendant's boots. But here's the problem. The mud and algae on my client's boots could have come from any mud puddle in Florida. Could have even come from the defendant's own elephant park. We'll never know. We'll never know because the government only took samples from one location, the Big Gum Swamp. And then they filled in the blank that Miss Bassett had been to that swamp. At this point, the government started taking bigger and bigger leaps in logic. They decided Don Clark was dead, and they decided he'd been eaten by alligators, but they needed a murder weapon. So what did they do? They filled in the murder weapon blank with an elephant trunk, even though you heard no evidence today that Don Clark ever came in contact with that tranquilizer. Fortunately for Miss Bassett, it's not enough for the government to simply fill in the blanks as they see fit. Instead, they had a burden to prove it. You see, the law requires that you presume Miss Bassett's innocence until proven otherwise. Conversely today, the government had to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Miss Bassett committed first-degree murder and that she did so with malice aforethought. Members of the jury, what is proof beyond a reasonable doubt? Proof beyond a reasonable doubt means you should be absolutely certain that Miss Bassett is guilty. But I ask you, members of the jury, are you certain of this? Are you certain that the swamp is involved? Are you certain that Mr. Clark is dead? Even if you're certain he's dead, are you certain that Miss Bassett was the one to kill him? And are you certain that she poisoned him with an elephant tranquilizer? Are you certain that he didn't just get in his van and drive to the airport? Are you certain there wasn't someone from Costa Rica waiting there for him? With the lack of evidence presented today, it is impossible for you to be certain of all of these claims. Under normal circumstances, you'd go to a jury room to deliberate a verdict around now. But these aren't normal circumstances. Today, we have a private Zoom chat for you. But just because you're at home or at your work doesn't make your job any less important. Today, your job is to deliver justice. But justice isn't just filling in the blanks like the government did. As the judge will explain in a few moments, it is your job to fill out the jury verdict form. And ultimately, it will be you and not the government that fills out the blank that matters the most. We don't know why Don Clark disappeared, but we do know that the government failed to meet their burden. And that's why, today, I ask that you find Miss Bassett not guilty and fill in the blank that matters the most. Thank you.
Your Honor, may I use my remaining time for a rebuttal?
Yes, you may. Well, before you begin, it looks like there was a note in the chat that you might have run out of time before. And so if we could just get confirmation from the second chairs that you do have time, that might be good.
I believe my second chair made a mistake.
So how off was he though? She has time. Okay.
I believe I have like 2 minutes about remaining. Is that correct?
Okay, perfect. We'll go with that. Okay,
All right, perfect.
go ahead.
Mr. Bellardo just got up here and tried to tell you that this case is just a series of blanks, but we have the answers that fit in those blanks. We're not just throwing in random answers. We are filling them with evidence that fits like a puzzle piece. Don Clark has been stipulated, declared deceased. Both parties agreed to that. The GPS data, Mr. Bellardo's case against that rests on a technicality with the GPS coordinates, but we found mud from that swamp in the van, on Miss Bassett's boots, on the wheelchair. That is a scary swamp. That's not just a random theory that a body could disappear in there. No, anything you throw into that swamp would disappear. Now, Mr. Bellardo's story, I wrote down what he told you that maybe Don Clark drove to the airport and was taken out by a Costa Rica mafia member on the way there. Well, that's an awfully big blank that he just filled in. There's no evidence to support that. There's no identified suspected killer. There's no evidence of a struggle in that van. There's another important blank in this case. It's the blank slot in the carfentanil logbook. The carfentanil that Miss Bassett had access to. The carfentanil log that shows there should have been 24 syringes. Thank you.
Thank you. That concludes the trial. Each juror should be filling out the rest of their ballot in that Google form, and I'm going to give everyone a few minutes to do that. And once everyone is complete and presses submit on their ballot, I want you to message our chat so that I can then sort of direct comments going forward.